odds with these kinds of like war motifs, and goes it goes on to call it an immensely readable novel, fluent, passionate, and emotionally honest. Equally astute in its analysis of Arab and American mores, the book's characters are nuanced and dynamic. It gives fresh life to the maxim, the personal is political, and I can't but agree with this review. As the reviews continue to pour in, Saleem has also given a number of truly exceptional interviews demonstrating his intellectual acumen and deep compassion for the issues at hand in his book. This is not just a novel, and that's part of the reason why Saleem is joining us here today. Saleem has also traveled quite far and wide with this book. This is the tail end of a Canadian tour, so we're lucky to be bidding him adieu as he returns to London from here and hoping that he will come back to visit us again. I do want to tell you a little bit about Saleem. Saleem Haddad was born in Kuwait City to an Iraqi-German mother and a Palestinian-Lebanese father. He graduated from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario in 2005 and has since worked for Médecins Sans Frontières and other international organizations in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, and Egypt. His first novel, Guapa, was published in 2016, a political and personal coming-of-age story of a young gay man living through the 2011 Arab revolutions. The novel received critical acclaim, as I mentioned, from The New Yorker, The Guardian, and others, and was awarded the Stonewall Honor in 2017. Haddad has also been selected as one of the top 100 global thinkers of 2016 by Foreign Policy magazine. I do think that Saleem is one of the great global thinkers of our time, not because Foreign Policy magazine gave him that honor, but because I believe so. He currently divides his time between London and the Middle East, and we're fortunate that he's able to divide his time not just between those locales, but here in Canada as well. Saleem's talk is entitled Reclaiming Queer Arab Stories. Following the talk, Saleem will join me in a moderated discussion where he will answer some of my questions about his lecture and his new book, Guapa, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Part of being a successful author whose book is making ripples far and wide is not having enough copies available on hand. I have tried as best I could to secure as many copies as possible for sale here at this event, but guess what? He's doing so well in Canada since having arrived that his books are selling so fast that Amazon.ca refuses to stock any more than 3 at a time. So I've bought one of 4, and here it is. This is the copy that I'm going to have him sign. But having said that, I would strongly encourage, for those of you who have not had a chance to read Guapa, this is a truly immense work and an incredible contribution to the literary tradition in English about the Middle East, to do so and to get your hands on a copy wherever you may find it. Without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Saleem Haddad.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Adil, so much for inviting me here and sort of dropping that email in November, offering this suggestion that eventually became this tour. And it's strangely fitting to be back in Canada and to talk about the power of storytelling here in Canada and queer Arab storytelling in particular, because it was here in Canada that I learned about the power of storytelling, about the power stories have in constructing collective imaginations. It was here, or rather in Kingston, Ontario, where I discovered how these collective imaginations could be used to strip away the humanity of a people, and in the process justify policies that might have seemed unjustifiable only a short period before. So in a sense, it's also strange but fitting that I'm speaking about some of these issues just a few weeks after Trump's new executive order, which was banning people from now 6 Muslim-majority countries from entering the US. Like Haddad said, I arrived in Kingston, Ontario to do my undergraduate degree at Queen's in 2001. Before I arrived in Canada, I had never been outside of the Arab world for more than a few weeks at a time. I had grown up on American television, So arriving here felt in some ways like stepping onto the set of a Hollywood movie. To be honest, I was secretly hoping it would be one of those 90s high school rom-coms that I was watching. Because growing up gay in the Middle East, the idea of living out a Hollywood romantic comedy felt impossible. But here in Canada, I thought, perhaps I might have the space to finally explore this gay identity of mine. Maybe I, too, could walk down these beautiful leafy streets, hand in hand with my bad boy gone good, my gang of fashionable friends, sipping our lattes and going to music concerts and speaking in snappy one-liners. But little did I know, but I was entering a movie, but it was something more akin to an action movie, and I was playing the bad guy. Because only 2 weeks after arriving here, 9/11 happened. And somehow overnight, I was no longer gay. Instead, I became an Arab. Classmates asked me lots of questions, looking to me to explain what was happening. After all, I was the Arab. I should be able to explain why we did what we did. But this Arabness was nothing like I had ever experienced before. It sounds strange to say this now, 15 years after the event, but back then it had never really occurred to me that I was an Arab. Growing up in the Arab world, nearly everyone around me was Arab. The identity was so implicit, so assumed, that other identities superseded it. So we were all Arabs, yep, but some of us were rich, some of us were poor, some had brown eyes, others had blue, some were Christian, others were Muslim. But in North America, what it meant to be Arab took on a new meaning. Being Arab here meant being labeled by larger forces, forces shaped by military strategies, media representations, national and international politics. Being Arab meant having to comment on the state of women's rights in the region, having to reassure people that we didn't hate Americans, and patiently trying to explain why justice for Palestine had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And I remember wanting to tell everyone at the time, listen, I can't even ask out this boy that I have a crush on, and you want me to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? So I came to Canada, thinking I'd have the space to come out and explore my sexuality. But instead, I found myself discovering and identifying with this new identity, this Arab identity. And it was not that I was no longer gay, it was just that my homosexuality no longer felt like the part of myself that was under attack here. Back then, in the aftermath of 9/11, and as the US government relentlessly assembled its allies to wage 2 brutal wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, so much of the Western collective imagination around the Arab and Muslim world focused on the cultural backwardness of Arab and Muslim societies. We were a region of misogynists, homophobes, religious fundamentalists. If we were not hanging gays or stoning women, then we were the women getting stoned and the gays getting hanged. How could I, a closeted gay Arab, even begin to challenge these narratives and face off against the colossal media machinery that was drumming the drumbeats of war? There seemed to be no way to do so. I felt that I would be swallowed whole. So within this environment, I felt that to come out as gay, I would in some way have to let something go. Was it my Arabness, perhaps, or my attachment to my family and friends back home? At the time, I didn't know what it was, but I felt the threat of the loss viscerally. What I did know, however, was that I could not come out without understanding what it was that I was coming out into. Ironically, it wasn't until I finally returned home to the Middle East that I was able to come out. I was able to fall in love and explore parts of my sexuality. And when I tell people this, I'm often met with surprise. To most people, even Arabs sometimes, it seems odd that it was in the Arab world, a region with no laws protecting LGBT rights, a region where queer bodies are reportedly brutalized, discursively and practically, that I found the space to come out. In fact, sometimes Canadians feel offended when I explain that I did not feel safe enough to come out in Canada. But in retrospect, I think what it boiled down to was that in Canada at that moment in time, I was not yet comfortable in my own sense of self. to ensure that I could express myself in a way that would not be warped by this collective story that had begun to develop around Arabs and Muslims. And last year, my first novel was published, Guapa. And the novel revolves around a young gay Arab man who's trying to find his place in a rapidly fragmenting world. Having toured the book over the past year in Europe, North America, and the Middle East, what has struck me was how often I found myself placed in these situations, in situations where my story was being co-opted or understood or manipulated, sometimes purposefully, other times not purposefully, to bolster political narratives that try to harm various communities that I might belong to. And what I'd like to talk about today is how these narratives are created, delve into their history, try to uncover some of the political goals and strategies behind them, and then try and talk myself out of that and talk about how marginalized communities can reclaim their own stories. When I'm asked about challenges facing queer Arabs or queer Muslims, I say that we are often stuck between a rock and a hard place. We are battling oppressive forces within our own communities, but we're also resisting the global narrative that tries to use this oppression for broader military or political goals. This was most obviously illustrated in the aftermath of the Orlando nightclub shootings last summer. I remember waking up the next morning to emails and phone calls from journalists asking if, as a queer Arab in the public eye, I could speak about homophobia in the Muslim world. The bodies of the victims were still warm, and already the first narrative began to take shape. The shooter was a Muslim. Naturally, it was an act of Islamic terrorism. The next day, Hillary Clinton renewed her vows to bomb more Muslim countries, while Donald Trump reiterated his call for the Muslim ban and congratulated himself for being right on radical Islamic terrorism. In all of this, the victims, mostly queer and from the Latin community, were washed white and ironed straight. No one wanted to talk about this being a homophobic hate crime against queer people of color. This became an attack by them on us. Just as frustrating were the Arab puppet regimes and so-called Muslim community leaders who, for years, had been silent on the violence perpetuated against their own LGBT communities, if they were not too busy committing this violence themselves. But now, they were all marching up to microphones to condemn the attacks. Many of us in the queer Arab and queer Muslim communities were filled with anger. We wanted to yell out, "You've stoked queer hatred for decades inside our communities. You have no right to give your condolences for what had happened, because you also have blood on your hands." We wanted to call out the hypocrisy of some of these so-called Arab and Muslim community leaders who had, in the words of a friend of mine, created a world where Omar Mateen would rather have died an ISIS fighter than a gay man. At the same time, though, we were also aware that our voices might only be used to bolster the story that was seeking to use these lives that had been lost to power military drones. Because in the media, Islam was very quickly scrutinized again, demonized, picked apart. And as it emerged that Omar Mateen really did not have any connections to ISIS, nor did he even have a grasp of Middle Eastern politics, and that he had expressed homosexual desires in the past, the narrative coalesced around the new story, that of a self-hating gay man from a culture and religion that would never accept him. In the small number of interviews that I chose to do following the attacks, journalists had no qualms about asking sweeping statements about what Muslim attitudes towards LGBT communities were, and about whether it was even possible to be both gay and Muslim. Again, for many of us in the Arab and Muslim community, LGBTQ communities, this was a very difficult and emotional time, because before we were even allowed to grieve for those who were killed in Orlando, we were first expected to defend the contradictions of our existence, as if these hyphenated identities were puzzle pieces that could be easily disassembled and showcased to those desperately searching for a soundbite. A year on from Orlando, the narrative of the self-hating gay Muslim terrorist has been firmly established. But what of this other, lesser-known narrative that can be woven out of Omar Mateen's personal history? Here are some facts. Omar Mateen was a gun lover. Omar Mateen was obsessed with the NYPD. Mateen was a strong supporter of the US military. Most relevant, perhaps, was that for nearly 10 years, Omar Mateen was a loyal employee of G4S. Now, G4S is the world's largest security company, private security company. G4S, much like Blackwater, are in effect modern-day mercenary armies that feed off of the war on terror. But not many question how it was that Mateen was able to pass a psychological test carried out by G4S, and what that might mean for the cultural practices of companies like these. Not many looked into the history of violence that G4S employees have. Here are some more facts. In 2009, a G4S security guard stationed in Baghdad shot dead 2 of his colleagues. In 2010, 3 G4S security guards were charged with manslaughter for the death of Jimmy Mubanga, who was an Angolan immigrant who was being deported from the UK. In 2015, widespread reports began to emerge of serious misconduct and abuse at a G4S-managed juvenile detention center for children aged 12 to 17. G4S also, until last year, provided services to Israeli prisons and interrogation centers. Prisons and interrogation centers that routinely hold children, political prisoners, and even clowns without charge or trial, and where torture practices are widespread. But instead of the story of Omar Mateen, the NYPD idolizing, US military-loving, gun-obsessed employee of one of the world's largest mercenary armies, we were told the story of Omar Mateen, the repressed Muslim homosexual terrorist. Now, my point is not to say that one story is more true than the other. It would be simplistic and untrue to place the onus of Mateen's actions squarely on the militarized masculinity employed by the American military-industrial complex. But it's equally simplistic and untrue to ignore all of that. But that's exactly what our politicians did. The story constructed around the Orlando tragedies show us that stories are all around us. We construct them and we consume them, often without recognizing that that's what we're doing. And storytelling is one of the most potent tools at the disposal of the powerful. It's not as directly destructive or brutal as guns and bombs, but its power is insidious and long-lasting. It has the power to engage our subconscious, constructing narratives and images that last for generations. This is not new. In Orientalism, the Palestinian scholar Edward Said showed how Western colonial powers constructed stories of the East through literature, art, photography, social science, to rationalize European colonial interventions as noble civilizing missions. For example, during the Victorian era, the British government developed a narrative that highlighted Egyptian society's mistreatment of women. And this was used as proof that Egyptian society was backwards and inferior to British society. This narrative was then used to justify the occupation of Egypt under the pretense of liberating Egyptian women. In some cases, sexual morality, or rather sexual immorality, served as fertile grounds for these civilizing colonial missions. 100 years ago, many European powers saw homosexuality as a sign of backwardness and set about correcting it in the countries that they colonized. This is why, for example, so many of the anti-sodomy laws in Asia and Africa were actually put there by European colonial rulers, including many of the anti-gay laws currently in place in the Arab and Muslim world. Now, my point again in bringing all of this up is not to dwell on history. Rather, it's to place the present in its appropriate historical context. Dehumanizing representations of the Orient as dangerous, backwards, they continue to this day. Images and stories of oppressed Afghan women helped make more palatable the call to war in 2001, and the more recent footage of ISIS throwing gay men off towers in Syria stoked the fires of intervention in Syria. as it relates to Arab queers specifically, the narrative of homosexual oppression in the Middle East is often used to illustrate the barbarism and backwardness of Arab and Muslim societies and justify military intervention or wash away human rights abuses. This tactic, often referred to as pinkwashing, is perhaps most aggressively used by the Israeli government in its PR campaigns over the last 10 years. The Palestinian queer activist Haneen Maaki defines Israel's pinkwashing strategy as the cynical use of gay rights by the Israeli government to divert attention from the Israeli occupation. And this is done through promoting Israel as a liberal, progressive country that respects gay rights, and then on the other hand, portraying Palestinian society and Muslim society in general as homophobic. For the Israeli government, pinkwashing was a very conscious strategy. It was developed around 10 years ago as part of a new PR strategy called Brand Israel. This was a $20 million global advertising campaign. The campaign aimed to portray Israel as a cool, fun, progressive country, and to downplay the narrative of the occupation of Palestinian territories. Gay rights play a very specific role in this branding campaign. To support the Israeli government in its work are a number of mostly North American-based groups. One of these groups, for example, Stand With Us, has stated explicitly that its goal is to, quote, improve Israel's image through the gay community in Israel. Another, A Wider Bridge, explicitly states on its website its goal of, quote, building LGBTQ connections with Israel. Soon after the 2006 launch of Brand Israel, advertisements and campaigns began to pop up, directly targeting LGBTQ communities in Europe and North America. Some of them aim to highlight positive advancements in LGBT rights in Israel. For example, on the Facebook page of the Israeli Defense Forces, there were staged photographs that were posted that showed two male soldiers walking down the street holding hands. In these photos, the Israeli Defense Forces, who are notorious for their brutal treatment of Palestinians, are transformed into an army that is accepting of gay Israelis and one that's serving with pride, even if the primary service is the occupation and control of a people. But what's more sinister than this tactic is the ways that so much of this Israeli pinkwashing relies on contrasting the story of a fun, tolerant, liberal Israeli society against an image of a dangerous, homophobic, and backward Palestinian and Arab society. For example, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in a speech in the US in 2015, made this statement: in a dark and savage and desperate Middle East, Israel is a beacon of humanity, of light, and of hope. In a similar speech, while talking about the virtues of Israel, he goes on to say that the Middle East is, quote, a region where women are stoned, gays are hanged, Christians are persecuted. And it's not just the Prime Minister of Israel. Here's the American porn star Michael Lucas writing in The Advocate in 2008, and I'm quoting a chunk of writing. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is a conflict between two worlds, one that is stuck in the Middle Ages and one that belongs to the 21st century. It's a conflict between civilization and barbarism, between freedom and oppression, between democracy and dictatorship, between human rights and violations of human rights, between those who treat gay people with respect and those who murder them, jail them, torture them, and dismember them, between those who treat women like equals and those who treat women like camels. The implicit, and as we can see often explicit, argument is that because the LGBT community enjoys a level of protection in Israeli society, the global LGBTQ community is obliged to support the state of Israel, even as the Israeli government continues to break international law. In this story, we see a clear juxtaposition of a tolerant and fun-loving Israel against the dark and savage Arab world. Israel becomes a beacon of progress, a modern, funky, hip place to be, a life raft of Western values struggling to survive in the dark, hopeless, barbaric waters of the Muslim world. The Muslim world filled with it's a nameless and faceless ocean of hatred and fear and death and despair. In this story, queer Arabs like myself don't exist, except as victims, usually nameless, almost always voiceless. Our images most notably seen with our hands tied behind our backs, our faces covered in cloth, or else in shaky and blurry YouTube footage as our bodies are tossed off towers. You see just enough of us, but not too much. This narrative was very strongly employed during the bombing of Gaza in 2014, as social media made it impossible to hide the levels of violence and brutality the Israeli government unleashed on Palestinians that summer. A number of ad campaigns were taken, highlighting Israel as a defender of gay rights in a sea of homophobia and hatred. Here's an article published again in The Advocate during the war, which was titled, "Why LGBT People Around the World Need Israel." Stressing the need to support Israel during the war, the writer argues, quote, "Unless we want the Middle East to turn into an absolute free-for-all controlled by extremists who want to kill us and turn women into slaves, then we need to do everything we can to protect Israel and stand in solidarity." Now here the writer is urging us not just to excuse the death and destruction that Israel was causing that summer, but in fact to see this death and destruction as something of a public service. They want to kill us, he warns. But who does the author mean by us in this context? I suppose it's the LGBTQ community, but it's certainly not the LGBTQ Palestinian community. There's no mention of the 2,000 plus lives lost that summer in Gaza, lives lost by bombs dropping from the sky, bombs that, as far as I'm aware, aren't equipped with a gaydar strong enough to distinguish between queer Palestinians and straight ones. Or is it simply that certain queer lives are worth more than others? Many queer activists, not just in Palestine but across the world, have been working tirelessly for the last 10 years to complicate this black and white story that has been woven by the Israeli government. Some have pointed to the fact that while, homosexuality is largely taboo in Palestinian society and in Arab society more generally, it's also largely taboo in Israeli society as well. Some have pointed out that the anti-gay laws, again put in place by the British, were abolished in Jordan and the West Bank in the 1950s, very soon after independence, while in Israel they remained intact for another 20 years. Others have pointed out that in its cynicism, the Israeli tourism ministry budgeted $2.9 million last year to promote Tel Aviv Pride abroad, which is over 10 times the combined yearly budget of all LGBTQ organizations in Israel. A fact that led to protests by members of that community in Israel who threatened to cancel Pride that year because they felt they were being used. But fundamentally, beyond all of these arguments is a single irrefutable point, that the acceptance of homosexuality within either Palestinian or Israeli society has no impact whatsoever on the inalienable right of Palestinians to live free from occupation. And this is the central point in all of this. You would think that there would be no amount of glitter that can conceal the thousands of prisoners, many jailed without charge or trial, the brutalizing force of collective punishment and summary executions, or the daily humiliation of checkpoints, ID cards, restrictions on movement and on life that the Israeli regime inflicts on Palestinians every day. But if you think that, you're wrong. There is enough glitter, actually, because in 2016, Tel Aviv Pride welcomed 50,000 Western tourists, compared to only a couple of thousand 10 years before. In 2011, American Airlines overwhelmingly rated Tel Aviv the best gay city in the world. And in 2016, Expedia awarded the Israeli Tourism Ministry an award for its, quote, innovative LGBT marketing campaign. Now, it's not just the Israeli government that utilizes stories about Arab and Muslim homophobia to validate violence of some sort. In Europe, where I live, the media and far-right groups regularly highlight protection of European LGBTQ communities as a justification to curb the flow of Arab and Muslim refugees into the continent. The Dutch far-right politician Geert Wilders repeatedly paints immigrants of Arab or Muslim descent as homophobic and as a threat to LGBTQ natives. In the UK, David Coburn, an MEP from the far-right UK Independence Party, recently stated that the UK should not be accepting refugees because doing so would mean that soon enough gay people in the UK would be stoned too. In all of this, it's perhaps not surprising. In all of this, it's perhaps there's like a
Yeah.
It's Israel.
it's Israel.
It's okay, we love you.
Feeling good. I get a chance to drink water. It's great. In all of this, it's perhaps not surprising, although terribly sad, that a third of French gay couples voted for Marine Le Pen's far-right Front National in the 2015 regional elections in France. The irony in all of this, of course, is that, in fact, many of those who fund all of these pinkwashing campaigns are, in fact, the most powerful opponents of LGBTQ rights around the world. The pinkwashing organization Stand With Us, which I mentioned earlier, are closely aligned with anti-gay evangelical groups in the US, such as Christians United for Israel. And in fact, one of the most notorious pinkwashing campaigns, which was a full-page ad in the New York Times taken soon after the 2014 bombing of Gaza, was partly funded by a man called Sheldon Adelson, one of the largest donors to the Republican Party in the US. This is a political party that is hardly known for its progressive same-sex agenda. The truth is that the biggest threats facing LGBTQ communities in Europe and North America are not foreign. It was Christian conservatives, not Muslims, who fought against same-sex marriage in North America and throughout Europe. And it isn't Muslims who are now rolling back LGBT protection laws in the United States. It's Donald Trump's administration, the same administration that talked about banning Muslims to protect LGBTQ individuals. According to the academic Maya Mikdashi, in the 6 months leading up to the Orlando attacks, over 100 anti-LGBTQ bills and laws were tabled and discussed across the United States. But not a single one of these laws was brought forward by Muslim or Arab individuals or community groups. Yet despite all evidence to the contrary, the narrative of Muslim homophobia persists. And I felt this very strongly when I was routinely asked following the publication of my novel whether I would be allowed to return to the Middle East and whether I faced any dangers or threats because I'd been so public about my sexuality. At one event in New York, I recall an interviewer asking me how it felt to be a writer in exile. And the question surprised me because, and I told her this, I had never thought of myself as someone living in exile. My family still live in the Middle East. Many of my friends do. I spend about half my time there every year. The idea of being in exile was not something that I felt at home with. Many interviews continued in this vein with well-meaning questions about my safety and the safety of my family. And over time, I found that these questions built a wall. They placed my queerness and my Arabness on either side of this wall. In publishing my novel, had I inadvertently prioritized my queerness over my Arabness? Would I be stopped at the border the next time I went home or arrested at an event? And what about my parents? Would my father lose his job? Could it be that I might never see them again? Was I in fact in denial about my own exile? In late June last year, I attended an event as part of Pride Week in Padua, which is a small Italian city next to Venice. I arrived in the afternoon, and the host took me on a tour of the town. And I enjoyed walking in the late afternoon sun, admiring the beautiful cathedrals which stood alongside the brutalist fascist-era architecture of the university buildings in the city. And as we walked, he told me the history of the city. He told me about the refugees that had been arriving that summer, how many of them were forced to squat in derelict houses on the outskirts of the city, and how this contributed to the rise of the far right in the city itself. That evening, arriving at the location where the Pride festivities were taking place, there was a noticeable tension in the air. Everywhere I turned, there seemed to be some kind of security personnel. And this was not very surprising because this was only a week or so after the Orlando attacks. But when I mentioned this to my Italian publisher, he laughed and he said that the security was there for me. And he was most likely joking, but I never really did ask again to make sure. Later that evening, I was brought on stage alongside a prominent local gay politician. We were seated on these large white inflatable couches on a large outdoor stage. The lights shining on us were so bright it was difficult to make out the faces of the people in the audience. The discussion was in Italian. I had an interpreter, but the interpreter wasn't very good. At a certain point, she resorted to simply summarizing the discussion, and I presumed also my contributions to the discussion. Towards the end of the conversation, the gay politician pointed to me and began to speak. Curious, I nudged my translator to interpret his words for me as exactly as she could. She replied, "He's saying that when it was first announced that you were appearing at this event, the Muslim community in Padua were not happy and they wanted to protest. And so he's proud that you decided to come today." "The Muslim community?" I whispered to her. "Who's in this Muslim community here?" And she looked at me as if I was stupid, and she said, "The Muslim people of Padua are in the community." I was asked to comment on this, and for a moment I was left speechless. Then I quickly dodged the question. But I realized that in that moment, I had been placed unwittingly as a pawn piece in a larger battle. A battle between these two fabricated communities. Two communities I had absolutely no connection with. Me, an Arab but not even a Muslim, was now asked to comment on how it felt to be exiled from the Muslim community of Padua, a community I didn't even know existed only a few hours before. More than that, for the first time on stage, I felt unsafe. And I remember looking out into the darkness of the crowd and looking for something, but I wasn't sure what it was that I was searching for. And for the rest of the night, I felt a certain unease that didn't really go away until I was back in my hotel room. The effects of the months spent touring in Europe and North America and the questions that I was regularly asked left me in an agitated and nervous state as I boarded my flight to Beirut a few weeks after that event. My return home should have been filled with excitement. I was going to visit family and friends in Jordan and Lebanon. I had a number of events lined up there, and then I was planning to spend a quiet week in the mountains with my family. But I began to wonder, instead of all of this, would I be spending the next few weeks in a jail cell of some kind, or maybe even something worse? I was now apprehensive. The cities of Amman and Beirut, two cities where I had partied with queer friends, fallen in love, and spent much of my childhood in, now seemed foreign to me. Or rather, I wondered whether in publishing the novel I had somehow become foreign to them. I had 2 events in Amman and Beirut, and a few more in Dubai later that year. One that included an audience of about 50 Arab housewives in Dubai, where I sat through some very intimate questions about gay sex. But despite that, I had no trouble at any borders, no protests, no thuggish crowds making any threats. More than anything, in fact, my event in Amman was in many ways transformative for me. The event was organized by Hibr, which is an independent media organization. And they're one of the few that are operating in Jordan right now who are carrying out hard-hitting investigative journalism and who aren't afraid to criticize government policy, even as the space to do so continues to shrink. I had agreed with them that we would hold the event in Arabic to make the discussion accessible to those who did not speak English, and had advertised the talk widely through their network across the country. The night of the event, the large room was completely packed, and many of those who were unable to enter were standing just outside the door on the sidewalk watching from the windows. There was something about that event that remains with me to this day. Perhaps it was the ability to speak about the novel in a city that is partly home to that claustrophobic apartment with my grandmother, that apartment that partly became the apartment in my novel. But more than that, I think what made the event in Amman so special was that it was done in Arabic. And I found that by speaking in Arabic, we had created a space to have a frank and very honest discussion about sexuality, language, gender identity, with a sincerity and a depth and an honesty that I hadn't found in my event in Beirut, which was done in English. Free from the threat of having our stories twisted to suit a certain political agenda, the event in Amman allowed a very diverse group of people from all ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, and sexualities to explore all of these topics with a sincerity and perhaps a certain type of optimism and hopefulness. And personally, I felt my words were suddenly unburdened by the fear of being taken out of context. And let's face it, I've been doing this for about a year now, and the global stories around Islam and Arabs can be so negative, so heavy in binaries and ill-conceived assumption, that trying to navigate and disrupt these narratives can chip and chip away at you until you are a raw and angry stub that's furiously nipping at any real or perceived aggression. But to discuss the novel in Arabic, to struggle to create and carve out a space for dialogue on these issues in Arabic, all of us working through the vocabulary, the terminology, discussing the context and meanings and history and implications of words and language and what that meant for identities and cultures, I was once again reminded of how powerful stories can be, how narratives placed on us from outside can alter our own perceptions of ourselves. The morning after my event, I made my way to the airport, and I was filled with hope and optimism. There was a lightness in my step. The conversation having the effect of a tall glass of ice-cold water in what had otherwise been a boiling hot summer of violence and fear. And it's been a year now since my novel has been published. I've done book readings and public events in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and I still get asked about the novel's impact on my own safety in the Arab world. But not a single person has asked me about the dangers I might face as an Arab writer speaking openly and publicly in the West. And yet, the only hate speech and personal threats that I've received in the 12 months since my book was published have been from white supremacists. Now, this is not to downplay the difficulties of telling queer stories in Arabic or of the challenges of having to navigate entirely different sets of political discourses in that language. Discourses that argue that queer identities are foreign to Arab or Muslim cultures, or that queer identities are shameful and even satanic. Nor am I trying to downplay the very real challenges that queer communities face in the region. The social violence that's inflicted on trans people and effeminate men, the raids on working class queer spaces, the absence of protective laws, or the fact that privacy is a luxury afforded only to those who can pay for it. In some cases, even worse than the roar of all of this violence is the silence of invisibility. For many of us, growing up queer in our communities with no obvious representations of ourselves in society or in the media, meant growing up feeling outside of our communities, somehow inauthentic enough to ever really belong. At best, we saw ourselves paraded out on talk shows and treated like carnival acts. Hidden from the public eye, our sexuality made us feel like, in some way, undercover agents working against our communities. The equivalent of a virus coursing through the veins of our societies. And with this dislocation comes depression and anxiety that continues to plague our LGBTQ communities in the Middle East, even as our visibility increases. And even if we navigate all of this, the loneliness, the depression, the violence, and the invisibility, many of us still struggle to break our minds free from the shackles of social shame and religious convictions that we were socialized in. To ignore all of these challenges would be foolish. And yet, alongside the stories of queer rejection and loneliness and violence and silence, there are stories of queer joy and love and acceptance and resistance. These strands don't just run alongside each other, they're cut from the same cloth. Recognizing the complexity of our stories, the way joy and pain, acceptance and rejection can exist within the same moment even, is what transforms queer Arabs and queer Arab stories from voiceless victims to empowered agents of change. When I look back to my writing process while I was writing the novel, and what drove me to wake up every morning at an ungodly hour and write down my innermost feelings on a page, I realized that I was driven by the urgent need to tell the truth as I knew it, in all of its shades of gray. To capture those moments where fear and love, joy and sadness, acceptance and rejection existed side by side in that perfect contradiction. And I hope that in doing so, I would myself somehow begin to understand these messy contradictions that made it so difficult for me to write this book. When we look at the narrative that's employed by the Israeli government and now far-right movements, we see queer Arab lives as nothing more than oppression and pain. We're told that Muslim and Arab societies are fundamentally unsafe for their queer subjects. We're told that as queer Arabs, we do not have a space inside our communities. Remember, by having written a novel about queer lives in the Arab world, I must now somehow be living in exile. After all, how else could an Arab come out so publicly while still remaining a member of their community? Underlying this discourse is the singling out of queer Arab suffering as somehow uniquely different from other forms of human suffering. But the reality is that for queer Arabs, our challenges and our solutions, our struggles and our stories, are inevitably the challenges and solutions and struggles and stories of those of our families and our communities. Our stories are those of our families, the good and the bad and the undeniably hideous. Our struggles are part of the wider struggles our communities face, not just in terms of authoritarianism and occupation, but also in terms of class struggles and the fight against the misogyny that underlies our own toxic cocktail of homophobia. For many queer movements across the Arab world, the struggle for LGBTQ protection and equality is intricately tied to broader political issues, whether it's the dismantling of authoritarian political and military structures, or in the case of Palestine, an end to the Israeli occupation. And in this vein, I've often said that my novel, or I don't see my novel, as a gay novel. When I said this once at an event in London, I received some pushback from some of the LGBTQ community, and particularly like European LGBTQ communities, who felt that I was perhaps rejecting that community. But in my mind, the novel is not about a single issue. It's rather about a cultural and political ecosystem, which affects the lives of everyone living inside it, regardless of their sexuality. And what I wanted to do was examine this ecosystem and understand how we are all in various ways simultaneously victims and enforcers of these social and political dysfunctions. One issue I'm highly sensitive to, and as a writer who is both queer and Arab, is the question of audience. And this is particularly important for narratives like these, narratives that feature protagonists facing double or even triple marginalizations. And with that in mind, I'm often asked whether I wrote Guapa with a particular audience in mind. But the truth is, for the very first draft, I wrote for nobody but myself. My writing was a balm to soothe my own wounds, a way to understand the multitude of contradictory questions that were swirling in my mind. But I could also only write the book if I imagined that no one would read it. And when no one reads it, that means that I was existing in a world without shame, without social shame. The social shame that had plagued and silenced me for so long. But I was aware from the outset that writing in English from the position of a queer Arab narrator, I was about to dive headfirst into a story that is misunderstood, vilified, and manipulated for cynical purposes. Because of this, I was vividly aware of the inevitability of not just one audience, but several different and overlapping audiences. And through various revisions, I read and wrote the novel with these different audiences in mind: a queer Arab audience, a mainstream Arab audience, an audience of Arab activists, as well as the different types of Western audiences that I could think of. And through this, I tried to maintain an awareness of the different situations, whether political, social, or cultural, in which the novel might be read. Looking back at that very organic process now, 4 years later, I can see that in some ways what emerged from this writing process is what Edward Said might refer to as a common ground of assembly. The novel, a single cultural product, begins to operate on a number of different planes, embracing not one single truth or point of view, but a number of decentered truths. While centering the queer Arab experience within the narrative, I wrote the novel with an awareness that this experience was traveling within an established Western discourse. And my hope was that the voyage of the novel would, in Edward Said's words, mix with this discourse, transform it, subvert it, and make it acknowledge the marginalized, manipulated, and forgotten stories of queer Arab lives. As a writer, I recognize that my words won't stop massacres in Syria. They won't stop the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Palestine, or bring down the military dictatorship in Egypt. My words won't create shelters for refugees, nor will they end the wars that made them refugees in the first place. But as a writer, what I can do is help produce new narratives, new stories, and new discourse that can move us beyond these simplistic binaries. In writing the novel and in engaging with readers around the world, I found myself discovering at a visceral, emotional level the power that stories can have in humanizing the dehumanized, comforting the weak and disturbing the powerful, and complicating these black and white binaries that political narratives work so hard to entrench. Fundamentally, no one is going to give us permission to tell our stories. As vulnerable groups, as marginalized groups, as misrepresented groups, we can't rely on the goodwill of the powerful to give us our stories back. Instead, it is down to us to take back what is rightfully ours. And if we look around and we can't see ourselves represented anywhere, that's a sign that we need to get out there and do the telling ourselves. Work to create the space outside of the rigid binaries to generate new, emancipatory, and complicated narratives. And in doing so, we must be wary, of course, of the harmful discourses we may be contributing to, but that should not silence us. And in our storytelling, we must ensure that truth must always be our target, empathy our guide, and nuance our strongest weapon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saleem. I wrote a few things here and there to kind of get a few problematics that I think are important for us to contemplate and think about. I was immediately sort of shocked at how incredibly telling it is that you had such a divergent experience with, as far as the reception of the book, between Padova, here's this like Italian city the home of Galileo. It's this kind of remarkable setting, and presumably a space where you might kind of challenge the norms of what is deemed acceptable. And yet you find yourself as a subjectivity purely securitized. And conversely, in this other space, in Amman, you're able to find these, not only an enclave that is so embracing and so compassionate and so protective, but it represents all that is not in Padua. And so it kind of cuts to this point about what it means to be in these multiple locales and where the surprises might lie. I want to turn this into a question by not challenging you, but challenging this kind of representation, and I hope that you will kind of engage in this.
Yeah.
But to what extent is this a function of the cosmopolitan spaces that are hybrid, complex, progressive? I mean, you mentioned Hebed. Hebed is a fantastic initiative of independent journalism in Jordan, for those of you who may have heard about it. If you haven't, you should check them out. But to what extent are these protected spaces of safety and refuge versus other spaces that are not afforded? And also this kind of the undertone of that is in the novel too.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think even with, I think that is part of the complexity of all of it, because even within the context of the event that we had in Amman, we were aware that we were operating within certain red lines, and what we were doing was figuring out how far it was that we could go. It was like blindly walking in a room and not knowing if you're going to trip over an electricity wire. I think definitely there are certain, I was aware that Amman and that event in Amman offered a certain level of protective space. I would not be able to do what I did in that space in Amman in another place in Jordan or another location. And that is part of the complexities, right? It's the fact that I might feel like I have certain laws. I'm in a civil partnership in London, and yet at the same time I know that in some ways holding my partner's hand in downtown Jordan might be safer than holding my partner's hand in a dark alley in London, right? It's about that complexity and finding a way to live within that complexity rather than reducing our experiences to these black and white narratives.
Can I push you a little bit further
Yes.
on the issue of sort of socioeconomic privilege and how class plays into some of these issues?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, class plays a huge role in some of these issues, and I couldn't have, when I was writing this book, I needed to make it very class conscious, right? Because even when it comes to issues of sexuality, how sexuality, well, two things. First, how sexuality is understood differs across different classes in the Middle East. Not just sexual identities, but also in terms of how certain sexualities might be deemed okay and others not. But also in terms of the amount of protection that you have to practice certain sexualities and certain sexual identities. That differs depending on your class background and how much privacy you can purchase and how much political protection you might have because of your class. And I can give a number of different examples to that. I mean, one obvious one in Lebanon is the fact that if you go into Beirut, there are a number of gay bars and clubs that no one will ever think about raiding because it costs $20 to buy a beer, versus working class spaces like cinemas, for example, where men who have same-sex relations and might not necessarily identify as gay, those places are often more dangerous and are more often raided by the police because there's less protection for that sort of thing, for those spaces.
No, absolutely, and I think actually, I'm in the interest of time, and there's really a lot to talk about. I want to take advantage of your presence, and I also want to leave room for the audience to engage. I want to say that while I was reading Guapa, I couldn't help but think of Edward Said, and I'm encouraged that as you presented your discussion and your really sort of provocative discussion around how to situate queer Arab stories, that you evoked both the language and the essence of Said's writings. But there are a few things that really came to mind as far as the Saidian method. that I thought were really kind of connected to the work. The first is the fact that Edward Said was quite fond of untidy literary works. I mean, he actually would use that word, you know, which is very untidy. And tidiness, I mean, he considered like tidiness to be the opposite of the virtuoso. Like the virtuoso, I mean, whether it's in the musical form, was just incredibly complex and layered and contradictory. I mean, another term that he would use is the contrapunto, which comes from the musical tradition. As I was reading Guapa, I couldn't help but see how incredibly complex and layered and discordant, yet harmonious, all of these kind of intertwined narratives were. And so I wonder where that came from. Did this come from your own sort of incredibly sort of convoluted life experience and the locales in which you were? Or is this constant negotiation back and forth with the perceived audience? Because you kept talking about like struggling with audiences. This audience might perceive this narrative to be such and such, and you're constantly like in a tug of war with audiences.
I think there were two things at play. One, I mean, I think the core of it was very emotionally driven, and the first draft of what I produced was very messy, extremely messy. But that was a very emotional sort of draft. And then I think what often is with Guapa, which is great, I mean, which is what you want from a novel, is people don't often recognize how much research actually went into it. Because I was, again, very aware that I was coming from a particular position. You know, I come from a particular middle-class Christian Levantine background. And within that, I have a certain worldview that might, and a certain experience of the region that might differ from other experiences in the region. And so I wanted to make sure that I was situating the narrative within the knowledge of a wider context. So I did a lot of research. I did a lot of research around LGBT experiences in the region. I did a lot of research around the revolutions. What I really wanted to do was also, because the book is about the 2011 revolution, so I wanted activists who were in the streets to read this book and feel in a way that it did not make light of their experience and that it was in some ways reflective of that. So even some of the language that I used, I was listening to a lot of activists. I was reading a lot of activists writing, whether it was Egyptian or Yemeni or Syrian, and trying to infuse the narrative within that language. And then there were also social issues like shame, for example. I dealt with shame growing up, and I think every Arab has dealt with shame growing up in various forms. So I brought my own personal experience to the narrative, but I also did a lot of research around shame and the social and anthropological elements of shame and how it functions, and that also fed into the language and into the narrative. I can't remember what your question was, but that's my answer.
It's about the discordant, and I think maybe to kind of zoom in a little bit, I'm one of the characters. For those of you who've had a chance to read the book, this will be a lot more kind of salient. But if you haven't, the experience inside Guapa, this really unique bar, and there's a particular few pages here that I would like you to kind of reflect on. I think it would be great to kind of read them.
Yeah, I can do that.
Is that
the bar scene? Yeah.
Yeah, the bar scene.
Okay.
For those who haven't had a chance to read it, I think it would be interesting to bring to life some of this writing.
So maybe to set the scene, Rasa, who's the main character, is reflecting on the last night, the night before, when he was in Guapa with his boyfriend or lover, Taimur, and they were watching Rasa's best friend, Maj, perform, or he's about to perform. Maj opened the door just wide enough to let us in. The bathroom was tiny, the sink dirty with smudges of black eyeliner. He pointed to the empty bathtub, and Taimur and I perched on the edge. The bathroom was hazy with smoke. Maj, a cigarette in his hand, was dressed in a Princess Jasmine costume, a turquoise bra, genie pants, and a long black wig. The bra straps hung loosely off his shoulders, the tattoo under his neckline in full view. He got the tattoo after the first violent attack on the protests, a simple statement in Arabic along his collarbone: "If you won't let us dream, we will not let you sleep." When Madge first started doing drag, he would dress up as Madonna on some nights, and other nights as Cher. One day he walked into Guapa and declared he did not want to perform as Western divas anymore, explaining that, quote, the appropriation of queerness into the capitalist system. It's happened in the West to such a terrible extent, and we're next, what we have. We're next in line. So he performed as Arabic pop princesses instead. He painted his lips thick and juicy like Haifa, put on a blonde wig like Elisa, and only lip-synced to Arabic songs. I found that while the lyrics had changed from English to Arabic, everything else remained the same. But more recently, he had changed once again. War on terror, neo-Orientalist gender fucking was what he liked to call what he did. Madge gave me a hug and took a swig from a glass on the sink. Are you ready? I asked. I'm always ready, Madge said. You'll be watching, right? Of course. That's the spirit, Madge said. We'll always have fun. If there's a bomb on the right, we'll dance to the left. He looked at Taimur with an expression of distaste. Isn't that right, monsieur? Taimur cleared his throat. Madge and Taimur never saw eye to eye and tolerated each other only for my sake. I suspect Madge didn't like Taimur because everyone else was so enamored with him, and Madge wanted to make sure Taimur knew that he was lucky to have me. Madge threw his cigarette in the sink, blew out the smoke from one side of his mouth, and pointed his thumb toward the door. Yalla go, I'm on in a minute. We left and stood in the crowd. Then, as the first chords of Genie in a Bottle began to play, Madge stepped out of the bathroom. He was wearing a full niqab, but the cloth covering his face had a print of Marilyn Monroe's face. The crowd roared. I remember Taimur chuckling next to me, and we watched Madge slowly take off the niqab and begin belly dancing in the center of the room, lip-syncing to the music. The crowd danced and sang along. The song ended and was quickly followed by a deep tabla beat mixed in with 90s techno music. Madge jumped on the coffee table, spilling a plastic cup of beer on the floor. Two younger boys crawled up beside him. The three of them wrapped shawls around their waists and swayed their hips furiously to the beats. You could tell the boys were from a Sharqiyya because they always put in more effort, and they seemed to dance harder than those of us from the western suburbs. They had more to lose by coming here, and their hips jutted this way and that, bouncing to the music, as if this might be the last time they would ever dance. Taimur pointed to his watch. I should have ignored him and kept on dancing, but I was hungry for him and nothing else mattered. I grabbed his hand and we stumbled out of the door like fools, sweating and laughing. We grabbed a midnight shawarma from the place around the corner. We ate our platters in his car in a dark alleyway under a large lemon tree. He was pensive, dipping a piece of chicken in and out of the garlic sauce in sad, hopeless gestures. What's on your mind, Habibi? I asked him. He looked surprised, but I wasn't sure if I startled him by talking or by calling him Habibi. I need to get out of this city, he said. But if you want to get out, then why are you... I don't want to talk about that, Taimur interrupted. For tonight, at least, let's act as if tomorrow isn't happening. Fine by me, I said, dropping a pickle in my mouth. You know, I don't even care where I go, he snapped, throwing his chicken into the pool of garlic sauce. He turned to me with an intense look in his eyes. He leaned toward me, sucked the oil from his fingers, and ran his thumb along my lips. If I leave, he whispered, would you come with me? His hot breath smelled of garlic and alcohol. Or would you just stay in that apartment with your grandmother for the rest of your life? I swallowed as his thumb made its way across my lips. I want to be with you. Isn't that obvious? So if you want to go, I'll go. And if you want to stay, then I'll stay in that apartment with her until the day she dies, or until I die, or until the day the city truly falls apart. Taimur sighed and leaned against the seat. Nothing ever falls apart just like that, he said bitterly. The city has been decaying for decades now, and it's going to keep on decaying. Unless we leave, we'll rot along with it. I laughed to ease the tension. Well, that's optimistic. The conversation exhausted me. I looked out into the narrow street, at the overflowing silver garbage can where a family of cats was tearing through the black bags. I loved Taimur because he was from here, because everything in him reminded me of everything here, because to love him was to love this city and its history. And yet I couldn't love him because he was from here. And so he held ideas of how to be and how to love, which would never fit in with the love that we shared. But I did not tell him any of this. Instead, I laughed and kissed him in the darkness. He kissed me back hard, and as the engine roared to life, I didn't want to ever let go. It was only last night, but remembering it now, I can't help but think how naive we had been, how full of hopes and dreams. We were playing with fire, Taimur and I, as we pushed and pulled, not knowing how to get somewhere. We weren't even sure we wanted to go. All the while, unknowingly, dragging each other to the desert to be shot. Yeah.
Okay. Can I follow this? How do we follow this?
You wanted to talk about the bar.
Yes, I do want to talk about the bar. I mean, to what extent? I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the book, or who are not familiar with the book, this is the story and the manner in which it unfolds. Taimur ends up getting married, and so the lovers are effectively separated by social convention. So the question that I have in regards to that is, to what extent, the fact that the lovers are not reconciled, the loss of Taimur being whisked away by like heteronormative, like matrimonial life, and sort of succumbing to conformity. The struggles embedded in Guapa and the queer Arab stories, in many instances, end up leading to a collapse, equivalent to the urban decay that you describe, succumbing to sexism, homophobia, Orientalism, colonialism, classism, you name it, et cetera, or kind of a lethal combination of all of these things. And yet somehow you are imploring us to think that there are queer stories of joy, acceptance, resistance, and love.
Yes, I believe that.
Tell us where we can find those.
Of course there are. Of course there are. Well, I mean, first of all, I like what you said about social, succumbing to social conformity, because I feel like that is very much a big struggle. It was a struggle that I went through, and it's not simply like I'm going to pursue an alternative lifestyle and people might not like it. I mean, you kind of need to place it in the context where, in most Arab countries, not including the Gulf, the state doesn't provide for you, right? So it's the family that provides for you. And so by entering into that social conventions, by getting married and by having children, you're basically securing your future livelihood. And by not entering into that, you are risking your future livelihood. So it's not as simple as just being alternative. There are very serious socioeconomic consequences to not playing the social game. And that's a challenge that LGBT people have to face. That is different than simply, I'm going to live an alternative lifestyle. But I think as well that there's certainly this hardship and these existential challenges, and some of us obviously, some of us like myself are lucky to have supportive parents. I don't think I would be sitting here if my parents weren't okay, or at least, okay enough to be able to say, you do you. I mean, for some people, they don't have that luxury, and it is a very lonely experience. But even for those spaces, for LGBT spaces, wherever they are in the Middle East, even if whether they're out or whether they're quite hidden, there is a sense of community and camaraderie that brings with it a lot of joy and a lot of fun and a lot of sense of family. And I think it's empowering. I think what we need to do as LGBT Arabs is not simply focus on ourselves as victims, but also to think about the strength in that sense of community and chosen family that we do have, and acknowledge that. That to me is important. It's empowering.
To what extent, and I know you write about the Arab uprisings and revolutions here, and the foreground of the story in Guapa. I'm curious if you believe that the uprisings, the revolutionary movements, the sort of youth resistance and dissidence campaigns that erupted across the region were at their core an opportunity for LGBTQ narratives to find their way to the fore. A lot of things get kind of washed to the side and say, well, this is not a priority now. Feminism and paternalism and misogyny, let's postpone that until we bring down the regime.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that there were spaces opened by that?
In the early stages, I did not feel like there were many. There were a few openings, but those openings were very quickly closed. And my experience of the protests, and I'm more familiar with the Egyptian and the Yemeni, is that those spaces were quickly closed because, precisely as you're saying, now is not the time. Now we need to take down the regime, and now is not the time to talk about women's rights, and it's definitely not the time to talk about LGBT rights. And in many ways, particularly in Egypt, the discourse was, we do not want to taint the purity of the revolution with LGBT language. So an activist would say, no, I'm for LGBT equality, but we need to think strategically, and we do not want to be labeled as Western, we do not want to be labeled as this and that, so we need to not talk about these issues. That was very much the discourse that I felt. And that that contradiction was what drove me to begin writing Guapa, was this question of will these movements create a space? What I've noticed now is that with the sense of frustration and the sense of despair with a lot of these youth movements, there's a sense that if I can't change the world, I can at the very least fight for my own body. And so I feel like in an odd way, while the political space is closed, I feel like there's a space that's opening up around some of these issues. Even in a sense of, I'm going to take ownership over my own body. And I think that there has been a noticeable rise, and at the very least, discussions around sexuality and homosexuality and transsexuality, especially, although that's a particular issue that's facing much more violence, like transgender individuals compared to the rest of the community.
I would love to talk to you some more about this issue of the body as political. I mean, we know that the revolutionary movement started with Mohammed Bouazizi sort of self-immolating and people putting themselves in the line of live ammunition, and then of course with the gradual kind of collapse of the revolutionary kind of impulse, people become much more kind of introspective and protective of the few spaces that they have left. But I do want to take us to a particular reading about the revolutions. Do you mind if we take a look at that, because I think it is particularly telling at this point.
Yeah, and I think it maybe goes back to the question of the hope.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is towards the end of the novel, and Rasa is sort of reflecting. The city is in the grips of a heat wave, and we are all trapped inside the furnace. Some choose to ignore the flames, hiding within a mirage of air-conditioned shopping malls, internationally certified hotels, expensive restaurants, and large plots of land awaiting construction. These lucky few build wedding cakes and towers of glass, concrete, and steel to shelter them from the flames. Meanwhile, inside imperial embassies protected by barbed wire and armed guards, fair-skinned men and women in flak jackets talk about fluctuating oil prices and counterinsurgency operations and stabilization projects and women's empowerment campaigns. And everyone is so self-important and self-deceiving and self-assured. For the young men who are driven out of the slums of Ashrafia in search of a piece of bread and some work, even if the work involves slitting someone's throat on a hunch that it might please God, denial is a luxury they cannot afford. The city, ever so deceitful, lures these men deep into the desert in search of salvation and then traps them in prisons to roast in the fire. The flames grip these young men by the throat, and as the last drop of moisture evaporates from their parched lips, there's only silence. But in the midst of this decaying, burning city, there are pockets of hope. They can be found in the tiny dark rooms in underground bars, where women with short hair cheer on men in dresses. They can be felt in the abandoned cinemas where anonymous strangers fall in love, if only for a few moments. And in the living rooms where families crowd around, drinking sweet black tea and Skyping their homesick relatives, so that together they can watch the long, rambling talk shows that go on all night. Despite the interrogation rooms where men in uniforms crack clubs and electric wires on the naked body of someone's son or daughter, despite the prisons where men transform into sadistic killers for a dream and a paycheck, there are still pockets of hope in the streets of the city. And it's in these decaying streets where the power lies. Street power, starry-eyed, raw, and foolish, like a hopeless romantic, used and torn this way and that by the politics of those living in palaces. For a moment, we had the entire country in our hands, but then we flinched. And now street power has been torn down. It's heartbroken. We kicked the revolution's body to the curb and tried to walk away, not realizing that we buried ourselves in the process. And once one person is killed, then another, and then another, the deaths become so great that one life does not matter to anyone anymore. You could be the queen of Guapa, yet no one but your mother will weep over your corpse. But still, there are pockets of hope, and denial is no longer an option.
I think, to an extent, the space of opportunity is exactly where the space of dehumanization begins. I mean, dehumanization begins at a certain point, and then it is also where these spaces emerge. Being on the fringes, being exiled, being unreconciled, being estranged, being outcasted, being outside of the standard kind of milieu affords people opportunities to discover themselves. And this is, I think, one of the great contributions of Guapa is characters that are very, very contoured and layered in such a way that even though they're very much at odds with the spaces in which they reside, and society is really suffocating them, and yet somehow they're able to prevail, but maybe not in the traditional sense. They don't emerge victorious. It's almost like the story of the revolutions. I mean, there are very few revolutions or uprisings in the Middle East today that we can kind of rejoice over.
Yes, yes, and I think that's where the ending of the book comes in, and we had this discussion over lunch today about whether the ending is a hopeful one or not, and then within that, what and the ending was something that I grappled with throughout the entire writing process, and it kept changing. I think partly as a result of the changes that were going on politically, which changed my own mood and sense of optimism and hope, but also because I think I was struggling to understand what a good ending looks like. And I think the idea of what hope is also very different, depending on how you're reading it, right, and how you read the ending.
Absolutely, absolutely. Saleem, I could monopolize your time for much longer, but I think in the interest of hearing from others, we don't have a roving microphone, but I think it's fairly easy to hear each other. So if you have a question for Saleem, please raise your hand, and we can maybe take a couple at a time. So, please.
I just wanted to say that today, and also my experiences over the last year and a half of living here in Vancouver, actually moved here because I thought, whoa, this is probably one of the gayest places on earth. I'll be happy there. And I think that I haven't received the warmth and the hospitality and the acceptance here that I have actually had in my community in Jordan of my LGBTQ non-binary brothers and sisters and everybody else. And I think I just wanted to ask, like, what do you think is going to, what makes you, sorry, what makes you hopeful for the future for, let's say, people like me and people like you to not rely on English, to not rely on going to Vancouver, Canada, or like just studying in like Western places in order to be able to be happy with their own skin and not be afraid and not feel alienated by their community only to leave and find out that
You're the alien somewhere else.
yes.
Yeah,
Speak
that's
to
a
that.
big question.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad I finally met a Timur because I've done readings everywhere, and no one has come up and said that their name is Timur, and it's one of my favorite names. So I'm so glad I meet a Timur. That's wonderful. In terms of positivity or like hope of some kind, I think it goes back to that part that I just read about pockets of hope. I think trying to find hope is a very broad thing, but you can find pockets of hope. You can find moments of hope. You can find spaces of hope. And these places are, like we were saying earlier, they're not necessarily geographically located in one place, right? What you were talking about finding something here in Vancouver and yet also losing something, I think that is the plight of people who are living these lives that are sort of crossing different spaces, right? And I think it's about appreciating what you have here in Vancouver and also appreciating the moments that you have back in Amman and that camaraderie that you're talking about. And the sadness is that you, in your lifetime, maybe you won't have a place where those two are connected, right? But it's recognizing the beauty in those two separate moments.
Well, thanks, Timur and Saleem, because I think that is a struggle as queer Muslims we face here, and those from different Muslim communities as well, and finding that space, and it's been very difficult, and becoming even more difficult with the resurgence of racism and so on. I'm really thank you for talking about pinkwashing, because that's a struggle we've been going through here in Vancouver with Pride and Queer Film Festival. They refuse to address those issues, and it's a struggle we still keep ongoing. Maybe can you talk about maybe the importance of that and how it oppresses queer Arabs and how much power it gives to Israel in terms of the emancipation of queer Arabs in that struggle?
Yeah, I can talk a bit more about that for sure. So I think pinkwashing, and it was done, and I think it's done most overtly by Israel, which is why it keeps coming up. There are two things at play, right, for pinkwashing to work. The first is you need to dehumanize people to such a degree where either their deaths are seen as an acceptable cost to pay for an ideal, or in some cases a public good, like when an article in the Advocate is published saying we need to support Israel because we're gay. That's one thing, so the dehumanization of population, and the second is the supremacy of gay rights above other LGBT rights. But I think the rise of the far right has given us a very clear opportunity to show the cynical use of pinkwashing, because Israel's pinkwashing strategy is cynical. It's not. There's always a grain of truth. Yes, there is homophobia in Arab and Muslim and Palestinian society. Absolutely. This homophobia is complicated, and it's not the same as the homophobia that exists here, because the community is different and issues of sex and sexuality are different, but there is homophobia. But that doesn't excuse the occupation of a people. It doesn't excuse the violence that's being perpetuated. And I think the rise of the far right has really given us and those who want to challenge pinkwashing an opportunity, especially for LGBT individuals, especially towards showing the wider LGBT community who might not necessarily be aware of the dangers of pinkwashing, pointing to someone like Donald Trump, pointing to something like the rise of the far right in Europe and how the far right in Europe have been using the same pinkwashing discourse And that is something that might be a bit more palatable to people who unfortunately don't humanize Palestinians enough to see their lives as worthwhile.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for what you said. And I do regret not going to the Haber event because I was there. I was in Jordan, and yeah, I just did. Yeah. So you talked about representation, and you said that we do not have any representation as queer Arabs. But recently, like, I don't know if it was there or like I just saw it because I came out in Jordan. I have no idea. But like once I came out, I found like there's so many other. We're speaking for myself, like lesbian Jordanians around there. They were like representing a lot of the community, and there was like Heber again, and there's a lot of LGBT community on Heber. What I'm trying to do is what I'm trying to say is, do you have any like hopes for, or do you think that the representation that already exists in Jordan is enough? Or do you think like maybe it needs more work?
Yeah.
What about like other countries like Iraq, Lebanon? I mean, I know of Helm in Lebanon also, and there's in Jordan there's Magali magazine also working there. So how do you think that the level of representation, is it going forward, backward?
I'm so optimistic actually, which sounds bizarre given what's happening in the Middle East, but I'm incredibly optimistic about these issues in particular. And I see, I'm 33, right? So when I was coming out, apps didn't exist. So you had to come out physically, right? And even when I did that, when I was in Jordan when I came out, immediately, like you're saying, this world began to open up to me. This world that had always existed, but it was not very visible because it's a very protected world. But as soon as you come out, you immediately begin to find out. Even like, and I wrote about this, the artist Shirihan, the belly dancer, and the singer Shirihan in the 80s. She's actually a drag queen. I mean, she's a female, but she's very camp. She's very queer in her presentations. She's a role model for a lot of gay men. Like, people looked up to her. And then when I was speaking to friends who were my age, and I said that, a lot of people said, yes, Shirihan, yeah, I remember watching her when I was growing up. So there are these role models, there are these queer aspects in our culture that I think we're slowly kind of reclaiming. I'm very optimistic.
I didn't know that about Shirihan, to be honest with you. Although I did recognize that her voice was much deeper than
No, she's a woman.
Oh no, I know. Yeah. I'm just curious as to how, like.
But there's something about her theatricality.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's another question right here. Yes.
Oh, hi. So I was wondering about the decision to write in English. I know that there's a lot of factors, and maybe if you know about like my colleague's publication in Arabic and the consequences of that, like what was your personal decision to write in English?
It wasn't a decision. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a choice. It was a matter of I think there are lots of things at play, right? Even though growing up in the Middle East, I didn't find necessarily the answers that I was looking for in Arabic. I struggled with Arabic in school, and I think I can go on and on about my own problems with Arabic, actually, with teaching Arabic in schools. But I ended up gravitating towards English novels as a source to understand the world. They provided me with a sense of freedom that I did not find in the Arabic literature that I was exposed to. That's the key, right? That I was exposed to, not that existed. So for me, writing in English, and especially around issues of sex and sexuality, where the words for Arabic was not something that was lived for me, was very natural. It became, so I was going to write in English, that was not the choice. The question then became, how can I do minimum damage, right? And that's what all this stuff about audience.
Yeah, I guess my question was like, when you write in English, there's
Yes, and also like what you're talking about Mike Kelly, what's interesting is that they were able to publish in English their Jordanian LGBTQ magazine, like an online magazine, and they were able to publish in English quite openly for a while, and then once they started publishing in Arabic as well, they faced a lot of pressure and criticism. So it was, the implication of that is basically, if you're writing in English, then you're writing for an audience that is not us, so you're not a threat. But once you're writing in Arabic, you're opening up the audience in the community beyond a certain segment of society, and that is threatening to social and religious forces, not the government in Jordan, social and religious forces. Yeah.
So the inadvertent sort of follow through to that question is Guapa going to be translated into Arabic?
I hope so. I mean, there's interest from translators to translate it, and I'm looking for Arabic publishers. So it's something that I want to do, and I'm aware that that might change the way the novel is received. At the moment, it's received very positively in the Middle East, but it's working with a specific language and a specific culture and all of that. And Arabic will open it up to a new language and culture. We'll see what happens. Yeah, but I'm also aware, to complicate this, because I like to complicate things. So like the writer Ahmed Najib, right? He published like an excerpt from his novel, and it's I think it was either a straight sex scene or a masturbation scene, but it wasn't gay, right? And he was someone complained, and he was arrested and put in jail for a year. He was just released last month. So he had a pretty difficult time, right? Compare that to I think it's Hamad Abdel Nabi, who published last summer, around the same time that I published Guapa. He published a novel in Arabic called In the Spider's Room, which will be translated into English. And it follows a gay Egyptian man who was arrested in the Cairo Queen Boat raid in 2005, I think, or 3.
Yep.
I don't know. So that's a gay novel. It has a gay protagonist, and it's very interestingly written. And he's been shortlisted for the Arabic Booker Prize, and he's being celebrated. So I guess it's very unpredictable, right? So a novel, I think, is also, there are all these different planes that all of these things are operating in. It's not as clear cut.
Any questions? We have time for one or two more questions.
You were speaking, Saeed again. It's always back to Saeed, isn't it? But you were speaking about the colonial structures that are put into place that are upholding sort of anti-queer laws all over the post-colonial world. And we have been speaking, I feel like, as academics, increasingly of decolonizing education. We need to decolonize this thought process. We need to decolonize that thought process. I'm West Indian myself, and there's this and if we apply this to the idea of decolonizing queerness, how do you see that playing out? Because I feel like there's this, it's not lazy, but there's this we'll decolonize this truth, and then we'll get to this pre-European utopia where we were all free and happy and brown and blah, blah, blah. The idea of then decolonizing queerness is, I feel like there's a bit of that narrative happening now, this idea that, well, before the Europeans, we were fine with being queer, and there's all these queer narratives the Europeans stole from us. And that's not to say that there's truth in it, but I think that it's become this mythology. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how that plays out in your own experiences in the Arab world.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important question. And I don't have the answers to it, right? Yeah, but I think you've touched on something that kind of drove the book, which is this real frustration with that narrative, which is, and so I don't know if you've heard of Joseph Massad.
I was going to take you there, but in the final hours, we've got 2 minutes.
So Joseph, one of Joseph Massad's central, he's like a disciple of Edward Said, and one of his central sort of, I guess, ideas, which is a very interesting idea and a very important idea, is this idea that through the colonial project and afterwards the the West, again, very black and white West, the West introduced heterosexuality, and through introducing heterosexuality, they introduced homosexuality. So they kind of created this binary in the Middle East where it did not exist. So it's a lot of what you're saying, but what he then, which is a very important argument, we need to understand this and be knowledgeable of it. Where I then have a problem is then, he goes on to say, people in the Middle East therefore do not understand gay identity, or do not feel an affiliation with a gay identity. It's an exported identity, and if subjects in the Middle East feel that they are gay, they have been colonized, right? So any gay act, so basically a lot of LGBT activists in the region got very angry because they said, you know, you're an academic, you're living in Colombia, and you're telling me that, you know, I'm battling to, like, against all of these forces, and yes, I identify as gay, or I identify as lesbian, or I identify as trans, you know, you don't get to tell me how I identify. So the world is a lot more complicated than these black and white identities, and this is from where Guapa emerged, because I thought, I'm just going to write the story, like, straight line.